Given the al-Shabaab attacks on the Westgate Mall and Garissa University, I'm sure your Secret Service could have suggested other countries for you to visit, but you wanted to go to Kenya.
Well, I think it is important, first of all, that the President of the United States underscores our commitment to partnering with countries around the world and that we're not intimidated by terrorist organizations. Second, the counterterrorism cooperation between the United States and Kenya and Uganda and other countries in East Africa is very strong. And part of the subject of the visit is to continue to strengthen those ties to make them more effective. Third, as I wind down my presidency, I've already had a number of visits to Africa, but this gives me an opportunity to focus on a region that I have not been visiting as president, and I'm also going to have the opportunity to talk to the African Union, so I'll be the first U.S. president to not only visit Kenya and Ethiopia, but also to address the continent as a whole, building off the African summit that we did here, which was historic and has, I think, deepened the kinds of already strong relationships that we have across the continent.
And you're going to talk about entrepreneurship at the summit in Nairobi. Mm-hmm. Is there any link between security and entrepreneurship?
I think there is. I believe that when people see opportunity, when they have a sense of control of their own destiny, then they're less vulnerable to the propaganda and twisted ideologies that have been attracting young people, particularly now being turbocharged through social media. And a while back, when we started looking at strategies to reach out to the Muslim world, to reach out to developed countries, a common theme emerged, which was people are not interested in just being patrons or being patronized and being given aid. They're interested in building capacity. The more we can encourage entrepreneurship, particularly for young people, the more they have hope. Now that requires some reforms in these governments that we continue to emphasize, rooting out corruption, increased transparency in how government operates, making sure that regulations are not designed just to advantage elites, but are allowing people who have a good idea to get out there and get things done.
And I suppose you famously said when you went to Africa, I think when you first became president, what we need is strong institutions and not strong men. You're going to Ethiopia, where there is effectively no opposition in parliament. Right. You're going to Kenya, where the International Criminal Court is still investigating certain members of the government, which seems kind of hardly ideal institutions.
Well, they're not ideal institutions, but what we found is that when we combine blunt talk with engagement, that gives us the best opportunity to influence and open up space for civil society and the human rights agenda that we think is so important. And a good example of this is Burma, where I was the first U.S. president to visit there. At a time when we saw some possibility of transition. By the time I landed in Burma, it is not a liberal democracy by any means, and there were still significant human rights violations taking place. But my visit then solidified and validated the work of dissenters and human rights activists, and that has continued to allow them to move in the direction of democracy. So our view is, in the same way that I visit Russia, in the same way that I visit China, even when we know that there are significant human rights violations taking place, we want to make sure that we're there so that we can have this conversation and point in a better direction.
Well, haven't the Chinese got there first in Africa? You're going to go to the African Union building, which was built with Chinese money. You're going to travel along Chinese-built roads. You're going to go past endless Chinese traders on those roads.
Well, what is true is that China has, over the last several years, because of the surplus that they've accumulated in global trade and the fact that they're not accountable to their constituencies, have been able to funnel an awful lot of money into Africa, basically in exchange for raw materials that are being extracted from Africa. And what is certainly true is that the United States has to have a presence to promote the values that we care about. We welcome Chinese aid into Africa. We think that's a good thing. We don't want to discourage it. As I've said before, what I also want to make sure, though, is that that trade is benefiting the ordinary Kenyan and the ordinary Ethiopian and the ordinary Ghanaian, and not just a few elites and the Chinese who then get the resources that they need. And I think that we can help to shape an agenda where China, Europe, and the United States are all working together in order to address some of these issues.
I'm going to suggest there may be one other difficult issue when you're there, and that's the issue of homosexuality, gay marriage after the Supreme Court ruling. I mean, the Deputy President in Kenya, who you're going to meet, Mr. Ruto, he said, "We have heard that in the US they have allowed gay relations and other dirty things."
Yeah. Well, I disagree with him on that, don't I? And I've had this experience before when we visited Senegal in my last trip to Africa. I think that the president there, President Sall, is doing a wonderful job in moving the country forward, a strong Democrat. But in a press conference, I was very blunt about my belief that everybody deserves fair treatment, equal treatment in the eyes of the law and the state. And that includes gays, lesbians, transgender persons. I am not a fan of discrimination and bullying of anybody on the basis of race, on the basis of religion, on the basis of sexual orientation or gender. And I think that this is actually part and parcel of the agenda that's also going to be front and center, and that is how are we treating women and girls. And as somebody who has family in Kenya and knows the history of how the country so often is held back because women and girls are not treated fairly, those same values apply when it comes to different sexual orientations.
Can we just move from difficult conversations that you're about to have in Kenya and the excruciatingly difficult conversations that you had in getting the Iran nuclear deal? I'm sure some people would say that, yes, you've set out the case why there is no pathway to a nuclear bomb now for Iran, but the net effect of lifting sanctions is that billions more will go to groups like Hezbollah, the Assad regime, and that is going to destabilize the region even more.
Well, keep in mind, first of all, we've shut off the pathways for Iran getting a nuclear weapon, which was priority number one. Because if Iran obtained a nuclear weapon, then they could cause all those same problems that you just listed with the protection of a nuclear bomb, and creates much greater strategic challenges for the United States, for Israel, for our Gulf allies, for our European allies. Second, it is true that by definition, in a negotiation and a deal like this, Iran gets something out of it. The sanctions regime that we put in place with the help of the Brits, but also the Chinese and the Russians and others, meant that they had funds that were frozen. They get those funds back. A large portion of those funds are going to have to be used for them to rebuild their economy. That was the mandate that elected Rouhani, and the Supreme Leader is feeling pressure there. Does the IRGC or the Quds Force have more resources? Probably, as the economy in Iran improves. But the challenge that we've had when it comes to Hezbollah, for example, aiming rockets into Israel, is not a shortage of resources. Iran has shown itself to be willing, even in the midst of real hardship, to fund what they consider to be strategic priorities. The challenge is us making sure that we've got the interdiction capacity, the intelligence, that we are building a much stronger defense against some of these proxy wars and asymmetric efforts. And we've sent a clear message to the Iranians. We are settling the Iran deal, but we still have a big account that we're going to have to work. Hopefully some of it diplomatically, if necessary, some of it militarily.
And you've had an intense campaign to sell the argument, which you've set out with great confidence.
Yes.
Have you managed to change anyone's mind yet of the Gulf states or in Congress?
Well, in Congress, I'm confident that we're going to be able to make sure that the deal sticks. With respect to the Gulf states, we had the leaders up to Camp David, and I described for them our interest in making sure that they build their capacity to defend themselves and their territory, and to make sure that destabilizing activities that Iran may be engaging in are checked. But keep in mind, our Gulf partners, for example, their combined defense budget is 10 times Iran's defense budget.
But have they got the willingness to fight? In the
well,
way
and that's the issue, and that's the challenge. So the point that I've made to them consistently is, you have a strong, reliable partner in the United States. But ultimately, how issues get resolved in the Middle East is going to depend on both strengthening military capacity, but also addressing the underlying social and political issues that may lead not only to Iran being able to stir up problems among Shia populations, but also addressing some of the issues that are leading to the enormous and significant threat that they face from ISIL.